Hello, American Musical Theater class. So, for Unit 5, we're going to start with 1980 and go up until the musical Rent happens. David Merrick was a ruthless producer and a promoter. He had a 40-year career on Broadway, and he produced dozens of shows. Hello, Dolly was one of his big hits. In 1980, the musical 42nd Street was also unique in that it began a string of several Broadway shows that got their source from movie musicals. So the movie happened first, and then the musical was translated from that. So that was the trend we saw happening from 1980 on. Gower Champion, who was the director and choreographer of 42nd Street, was also a big name at the time and a very influential person. However, unfortunately, he died the opening night of 42nd Street. An interesting piece of tidbit is that David Merrick turned that into a publicity stunt by announcing Champion's death after the show was over at the curtain call, if you can imagine that. So, some of the trends in Broadway then at the end of the 20th century was, first of all, there was a lack of money. So we saw a lot of revivals happening of old golden favorites. Theatrical costs skyrocketed due to labor unions, theater rent, and the mounting advertising costs. And advertising techniques were moving into multimedia modes. The producer's main job then becomes the fundraiser, tapping into major investors, trying to get people to back the shows. Another thing that happened by the end of the 20th century is that regional theaters across the country become sort of a nursery for developing new works. And then the British invasion occurs. 1982, Andrew Lloyd Webber brings his famous show Cats from the West End in London to Broadway. This was a concept musical, as we talked about last week, based on T.S. Eliot's poems. This show went for 18 years, 7,000 performances, and it was the longest in Broadway history. And as I said before, it's not really a book musical. It was definitely a concept musical, more like a revue that was heavy on spectacle. Another man enters the scene at this time who has been very influential even now, Cameron Mackintosh. He was the one who produced Cats, and he began to produce a bunch of mega hits that happened coming from invading us, really, from Britain. He first produced the show in London. He found out if he did the shows there first, he could do them for half the cost that it cost to do it on Broadway. And then he could translate it to Broadway after it was already famous, and a lot of people would invest into it. So a very good opera plan. Phantom of the Opera, I meant, was one of those two, and it was a very good plan for that one. So then the mega musicals are hitting. That's one of the reasons the mega musicals happened, is because the producers could really recoup a huge investment from what they put into it. Some of the things that are important about mega musicals is that they are always spectacles, larger than life, emotions that are just charged, and characters that, probably aren't realistic, but we get to live these huge emotions through these amazing characters. Mega hit musicals also changed the ways that shows are promoted. Cameron Mackintosh, and you can read more about him in the textbook, his shows have grossed more than $8 billion worldwide to date. Also, the style of music and vocals in these mega hit musicals becomes more pop-oriented and more generic in sound. That way, a number of actors could step in and play these roles and tour across the world, and everything would sound pretty much like the original guy or girl. So we're losing the uniqueness of such stars as Ethel Merman and Mary Martin for a more generic pop sound and style is starting to take over. Another thing that happened starting in the mid-1980s is that Stephen Sondheim and Harold Prince stopped working with each other. At this point, Stephen Sondheim wasn't producing much, and he was approached by a lyricist and book writer named James Lapine to do an experiment, and they decided to workshop this off-Broadway and try to just be more artistic and not worry about if it was going to become a mega hit. And what I'm talking about is Sunday in the Park with George. It was inspired by a pointillist painting from the 18th century by Georges Seurat. It's an intensely personal look into Seurat's life, but what's funny about that is we don't know much about Georges Seurat. So basically they were making up this story inspired by the painting. Another thing interesting about this, it's really a musical about how art is created. And it won the Pulitzer Prize for Drama. So that's a very significant show for Stephen Sondheim and James Lapine. Another 1980s show, totally different, that followed conventional musical theater form and had very hummable tunes, but a very unconventional romance, was Jerry Herman's La Cage aux Folles. The romance was unconventional because it was two gay characters. La Cage aux Folles was the first time on the Broadway stage that a man sang a love song to another man, and it was the first gay musical to be successful at the box office. It garnered huge awards and won the Tony for Jerry Herman that year for the musical score, beating out Stephen Sondheim. Another thing that's happening at this point is that the AIDS crisis is coming to the forefront. And Broadway Cares Equity Fights Against AIDS begins with the cast of La Cage aux Folles. So that's another milestone in how Broadway is getting involved in culture. And finally, another big influence on Broadway is the corporate influence, especially Disney. Disney's string of animated movie musicals began to be produced into Broadway live shows. They began with The Little Mermaid in 1989, in 1994, Beauty and the Beast. And what happens nice with Beauty and the Beast is that they needed such a huge stage and a huge set that the New Amsterdam Theater was restored. Disney decided to jump in there. They needed a big place like that. They restored it and made it so that it would really appeal to the families that would come in to see it. You recall from your textbook that the mayor of New York City was having to get involved in trying to clean up 42nd Street and Broadway, and he assured Disney's Michael Eisner that this would happen. So, at this point in 1997 then, the Lion King adaptation moved in. It was a landmark musical in that it brought in Elton John and Tim Rice as songwriter and lyricist from the animated film. They had to do a lot more songs for this show. And in order to get the feeling of, the jungle and the animals, which were the main characters, the director, Julie Taymor, used a combination of masks and actors' bodies to create the animals. I suggest you try to find some YouTube videos to see some of these songs if you can, if you have never seen The Lion King live. It's just spectacular. Both Beauty and the Beast and The Lion King have grossed more than $2 billion each in various worldwide productions. So we can see that this new idea, this new venue that Disney had in mind is really taking root. So that's all for this week, and I'll see you online.